The scars on Jennifer Walsh's wrists told a story she hoped no one would notice. She pulled her sleeves down carefully as she sat in the Family Feud waiting area. Her brother David squeezed her hand gently, a gesture they'd practiced countless times over the past 3 months. "You sure you're ready for this?" he whispered. Jennifer nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. This was supposed to be her comeback, her return to the world of the living. The Walsh family from Portland had been selected after months of auditions. David had submitted their application as part of Jennifer's therapy, something to look forward to, something to keep her anchored to tomorrow. Steve Harvey's voice boomed across the studio as the cameras prepared to roll. The energy was infectious, designed to make families forget their troubles for a few hours. But Jennifer carried troubles that even television magic couldn't erase. She wore a long-sleeved burgundy blouse that covered the evidence of her darkest night. 3 months ago, she had decided that living was too painful to continue. Her brother had found her in time, barely. The game began with its usual fanfare. The Walsh family faced the Rodriguez family from Texas in what should have been a light-hearted battle. Steve worked his magic, drawing laughs from both families and the studio audience. Jennifer stood at the end of her family's podium, trying to smile. She had practiced this in therapy, engaging with the world again. But every joke felt hollow. Every moment of joy felt borrowed from someone else's life. "Survey says," Steve announced as the first round progressed. The Walsh family was doing well, their answers lighting up the board consistently. David kept glancing at his sister, checking for signs of the darkness that could descend without warning. The studio lights were bright and warm. For most contestants, they represented excitement and possibility. For Jennifer, they felt exposing, as if everyone could see through her carefully constructed facade to the brokenness underneath. During a commercial break, Steve worked the audience as he always did. His natural charisma filled the studio, making strangers feel like family. He noticed Jennifer immediately, standing quietly, while her family celebrated around her. There was something in her posture that caught his attention. The way she held herself apart, as if she didn't quite belong in the moment. Steve had learned to read people over decades of television, and Jennifer was carrying something heavy. "You doing okay over there?" Steve asked during the break, walking toward the Walsh family podium. Jennifer managed a weak smile. "Just nervous," she replied, her voice barely audible over the studio noise. David stepped closer to his sister protectively. "She's been looking forward to this for months," he said. But his tone carried worry that Steve immediately recognized. Something wasn't being said here. The cameras came back on. Steve returned to his position, but his eyes kept drifting to Jennifer throughout the next round. Her family was winning, but she seemed disconnected from their success, lost somewhere inside herself. The fast money round arrived. David went first and scored a respectable 157 points. The family needed only 43 more points to win the $20,000. Money that could change their lives. Jennifer stepped up to the podium. Her family cheered behind her, but she barely heard them. The studio lights felt hotter now, the audience larger, the pressure mounting in ways that had nothing to do with the game. "All right, Jennifer," Steve said, his voice gentle. "You need 43 points to win $20,000 for your family. You ready?" She nodded, gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles went white. The questions began. "Name something people do when they're happy." "Laugh," Jennifer answered mechanically. "Name something you might find at a wedding." "Flowers." "Name something that brings families together." "Holidays." "Name something people collect." Jennifer hesitated. The word memories formed in her mind, but it brought with it a flood of pain. Memories were things she'd been trying to escape, moments that felt too heavy to carry. "Coins," she said finally, the safest answer she could think of. "Final question, Jennifer. Name something that makes life worth living." The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Jennifer stared at Steve, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. This was the question she'd been asking herself for months, the one her therapist asked every session. The studio waited. Her family waited. Millions of viewers would eventually wait. But Jennifer had no answer because she genuinely didn't know anymore. The silence stretched beyond comfortable television timing. Jennifer started, then stopped. Her breathing became shallow, the familiar signs of panic beginning to rise in her chest. The bright lights suddenly felt like interrogation lamps, the audience like a jury waiting for her to explain why she deserved to be alive. "I don't know," she whispered, so quietly the microphones barely picked it up. But the cameras caught everything. The way her face crumpled, the tears that started flowing, the way she gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of episodes. He'd seen contestants freeze, seen them get emotional, seen them struggle with difficult questions. But this was different. This wasn't stage fright or game show pressure. He set down his cards and walked toward Jennifer. Not the measured walk of a television host, maintaining show pace, but the urgent stride of a human being, recognizing someone in crisis. The studio fell silent as protocols were abandoned. "Jennifer," Steve said softly, reaching the podium, "talk to me. What's going on?" Behind the scenes, Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. She looked up at Steve, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to kill myself 3 months ago," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The words echoed across the studio like a shockwave. Audience members gasped audibly. Camera operators struggled to keep their shots steady. "I don't know what makes life worth living," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I came here because my brother thought it might help me remember. But I still don't know." The studio was completely silent. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, found himself in territory no game show had ever prepared him for. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was life and death. "Jennifer," Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, wiping her face with trembling hands. "What stopped you from finishing what you started?" Jennifer looked toward her family, then back at Steve. "My brother found me," she said simply. "He wouldn't let me go." David was crying now, standing at the family podium with tears streaming down his face. He had never heard his sister speak so openly about that night. The night he'd broken down her bathroom door, the night he'd called 911 while holding her bleeding wrists, the night he'd almost lost the only family he had left. Steve looked at David, then back at Jennifer. In that moment, he understood something profound about the power of love to interrupt even the darkest plans. "And since then," he asked gently. "Since then I've been trying to figure out why he saved me," Jennifer replied, trying to find a reason to justify his choice. The honesty in her voice was devastating. This wasn't a cry for help or attention. This was someone genuinely struggling to understand their own existence. Steve Harvey had made people laugh for decades. But in this moment, he learned something about the difference between entertaining people and saving them. He did something unprecedented in television history. He walked around the podium and pulled Jennifer into a hug. Not a quick, camera-friendly embrace, but the kind of hug that says you are not alone. The kind that transfers strength from one human being to another. "Jennifer," he said, still holding her, "I want to tell you something, and I want everyone in the studio to hear it." He pulled back to look at her face. "The fact that you're standing here right now asking that question, that's your reason." The audience began to respond. Not with applause, but with sounds of recognition, of shared humanity. People were crying openly, touched by the raw honesty of what they were witnessing. "You see," Steve continued, "some people spend their whole lives never asking what makes life worth living. They just go through the motions. But you're fighting for an answer. That fight itself is what makes you worth saving." But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, Jennifer just did something braver than any game show stunt. She told the truth about pain, about wanting to give up, about not having answers." His voice carried across the studio with the weight of absolute conviction. and in doing that, she probably just saved someone else's life. Someone watching at home who's asking the same question she is. Jennifer was sobbing now, but differently than before. These weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen for the first time in months. "But I still don't know," she whispered. "That's okay," Steve replied. "Not knowing is okay. The question isn't whether you have all the answers. The question is whether you're willing to keep looking for them." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Without explanation, he dialed a number while the cameras continued rolling. The conversation was brief, conducted in whispers that only Jennifer could hear. When he finished, he looked back at her with something approaching hope. "Jennifer, I just called some friends of mine, people who understand what you're going through, people who've asked the same questions you're asking." He handed her a business card. "This isn't just my number, it's a lifeline. You use it whenever that question gets too heavy to carry alone." The Rodriguez family, who had been watching this unfold from their podium, abandoned their competitive position. They walked across the stage and surrounded Jennifer, their opponents becoming her support system in a matter of minutes. "You know what?" Steve announced to the studio. "Both families win today. Because today we learned something more valuable than any prize money." He looked directly into the main camera. "We learned that the bravest thing you can do is admit when you're struggling, and we learned that none of us has to struggle alone." The audience rose to their feet. Not in the programmed applause of a television taping, but in genuine recognition of courage they had just witnessed. Jennifer stood surrounded by strangers who had become family, held up by love she hadn't known existed. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. Steve removed his suit jacket, the one he wore for every taping, and gently placed it around Jennifer's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me through every show," he said. "Now it's going to remind you that you've got a whole studio family who believes your life is worth living." Jennifer clutched the jacket around herself. It was warm from Steve's body heat, substantial in a way that made her feel grounded. For the first time in months, she felt held by something other than her brother's desperate grip. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something unprecedented happened. People didn't leave. They approached Jennifer one by one, sharing their own stories of struggle, of darkness, of finding reasons to continue. An elderly woman had lost her husband of 50 years. A young father was battling addiction. A teenager struggling with depression. Each person who spoke to Jennifer added another thread to a tapestry of survival that she hadn't known existed. Steve stayed with her through it all. This wasn't publicity or show business. This was human ministry happening in a television studio, proof that authentic connection could break through any barrier. The episode aired 6 weeks later, exactly as it had been filmed. No editing to remove Jennifer's confession. No softening of the hard truth she had spoken. The response was unlike anything in television history. The suicide prevention hotline reported a 300% increase in calls the night it aired. Not from people in crisis, but from people offering to help. From survivors sharing their stories. From family members learning how to talk about mental health. Jennifer became an unintentional spokesperson for something she was still learning to understand. She appeared on Steve's talk show, not as a game show contestant, but as someone whose honesty had started a national conversation about suicide and survival. The business card Steve had given her became a lifeline she used more than once. During the dark nights when the old questions returned, she would call and find people who understood, people who had asked the same questions and found different answers. Steve's jacket hung in her closet like a talisman. She wore it to her first public speaking engagement, where she talked to a room full of teenagers about the difference between wanting to die and wanting the pain to stop. The money the Walsh family won that day went toward Jennifer's continued therapy and a foundation she started with David. But more importantly, the moment of recognition she experienced in that studio became the foundation for everything that followed. 6 months later, Jennifer had an answer to Steve's question. Not a simple one, but a real one. Life was worth living because her pain, once shared, became a bridge to other people's healing. Her questions, once spoken aloud, became permission for others to ask their own. She learned that the answer wasn't about individual happiness or personal fulfillment. It was about connection, about the ways broken people could hold each other up, about how honesty could transform isolation into community. Today, Jennifer speaks regularly about mental health and suicide prevention. She tells audiences that she still doesn't have all the answers, but she's no longer afraid of the questions. She's learned that seeking help isn't weakness, it's courage. The scars on her wrists remain visible. She no longer tries to hide them. They've become part of her story, evidence of how far she's traveled from that dark night to this moment of purpose. Steve Harvey still keeps a photo from that day in his dressing room. Not the official publicity shot, but a candid moment of Jennifer surrounded by strangers who had become family. It reminds him that sometimes the most important television happens when the cameras capture something real. The studio audience from that day formed an informal support network that continues to this day. They check on each other during difficult times, celebrate victories together, and prove that shared moments of truth can create lasting bonds. Jennifer's story proves that sometimes the question isn't whether life is worth living. Sometimes the question is whether we're brave enough to admit when we don't know the answer, and wise enough to keep looking for it with help from others. Because the answer isn't something you find alone. It's something you build together, one honest conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one decision to stay and see what happens next. And sometimes, it starts with the simple courage to say, "I don't know," in front of people who care enough to help you keep looking.